please ensure that you keep yourself on mute. And then you'll also have 20 minutes at the end to ask any questions. So as I said, last month, we had our first corporate allyship event of the series. That was around the do's and don'ts of corporate allyship. And it was here we defined and clarified terms such as performative allyship and how to spot box ticking within your organization. It also helped us kind of set us in the right foot for the decade. So just to kind of introduce myself, I completely forgot to do this in the beginning. So my name is Mira, and I am the co-founder and head of partnerships at BYP Network. So BYP Network is the largest network of Black professionals in the UK. So we have around 50,000 members, and the reason we exist is to change a Black narrative. And one of the things I always say is we wouldn't be where we were if it wasn't for the allies that have helped and pushed the organization. And secondly, a lot of the companies we work with and the teams we work with are majority allies. So this event is focused on how HR can role model active allyship. And on our panel, we've got two incredibly experienced HR professionals, because what I believe is, we need advocates who are prepared to take consistent and meaningful action to ensure their organizations are safe and inclusive for all kinds of people. As we know, Black talent is often the victim of biases and microaggressions at work, and that hinders representation and progression, particularly in the corporate workplace. I want to kind of start with talking about a few stats that I read recently as part of a McKinsey report that highlight the issue that we have within the workplace, specifically with Black and minority talent. So for example, like underrepresented ethnic individuals represent more than 20% of the UK's undergraduate students, but only 10% of entry-level employees within 6 months of graduation, and only 5% of senior level positions. 25% of HR directors and 36% of D&I practitioners have reported and said that there have been no Black, Asian, or underrepresented ethnic minorities on their main board. So these are some statistics that that we see. So for example, Black and minority professionals need to apply for 80% more roles to get the same positions. So this panel is kind of discovering and talking and trying to understand how HR can role model and change the status here. I'm really excited to introduce our two panelists. So we have Hannah Reid here. Hannah, if you want to give a little bit of a wave. She's the people director at Apple, and Tom Lofert, who is a senior HR executive with over 20 years experience. Now, both of them can do a better introduction than I can. So I'm going to pass it on to both of them. Hannah, if you want to start and introduce yourselves to the to everyone else here.
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for having me on this very important topic that I'm hugely passionate about. Much easier to talk about the topic than to welcome and to introduce myself, because that part that nobody really likes to do too much. But I've been in HR now for over 18 years. Majority of that time now has been spent in senior leadership positions for various global organisations, as well as the City of London Police, so not quite global in that regard. However, my time at the police, I was one of the highest ranking Black civilians in the country, and did a lot of work with the government, which no doubt will come up in the course of this conversation. I also sit on the board for Ravensbourne University, a deliberate decision I took to want to be part of education, almost to your earlier point, Mira, about trying to influence an area which is really, really underrepresented and very important as far as changing the narrative for the future. I've won a couple of accolades that people refer to more, but actually is more in recognition of some of the work that I've done as a senior leader in this industry.
Thank you so much, Hannah. How about you, Tom?
Yeah, no, again, thank you for having me on the panel today. And I'm just, again, like Hannah, this is a topic that I personally lived, as well as tried to drive pretty much in every organization I worked at. So until recently, I was the vice president of HR for GlaxoSmithKline's global digital and technology organization. And then prior to that, have worked seemingly it seems like all over the world and for half the Fortune 500, but at large global branded organizations inside technology, retail, apparel, and consumer packaged goods in the pharmaceutical industry, and have a very strong view on really what the role of HR is, and how, frankly, if it is not actively engaged in driving a talent strategy as inclusive of D&I, then you probably have some challenges and issue with your HR organization as a whole, in terms of how modern it is within your organization. So I could probably spend weeks talking about this topic alone. So anyways, I'm going to stop there and wait for the questions to come, and we'll go from there. But thank you again for having me.
I love that both of you said you could speak for hours about this topic. Unfortunately, we only have an hour, so we're going to have to and condense it all. But I guess I'm going to start with just to kind of as a simple one, like how would you describe corporate allyship? I'll start with you, Tom. How would you describe corporate allyship?
Yeah, I mean, I look at it from two lenses, both internal and the external. And I think the external is, do you see organizations that are not just paying lip service and doing marketing campaigns, but look at their board composition, look at the composition of their senior leadership team. What are they doing to actively engage talent and move that talent through an organization is how at the highest level I define it. Internally, it really is about, and I think this is the key, how are organizations shaking up the power structure and allowing people who have been shut out of that power structure for generations to actually assume power to shape what that organization and its people become. And what do I mean by that? Are people who are not, dare I say, white, straight, and male and middle-aged being actively sponsored within the organization to move up? Because frankly, for many of us probably on this call, how we move forward in our careers is through active sponsorship by people who were senior to us. And I think that's a critical indicator of how, when you talk about corporate allyship, what that means. Are they investing in and supporting employee network groups? Are they investing in a comprehensive D&I strategy that is measured and metric and driven and shows outcomes, right? I think too often, many companies get into doing a lot of activity, but not measuring outcome and impact. And I think that's also a key indicator of how, what corporate allyship looks like to me. And Hannah, please, I'll turn it over to you.
Amazing. And yeah, I would say it's that championing and advancing, driving, elevating, actively supporting, raising awareness, right? And I think for me, when I was making that distinction between allyship and then, the question of corporate allyship, I think corporate environments are almost, a breeding ground for people to almost be dormant or passive or kind of hide behind the organization that they work for, right? So I think it's about stepping out from behind that facade and stepping forward. So rather than just being, turning up to something and saying that you're anti-racist, demonstrating being anti-racist, right? So speaking up, not being over-reverent and just consumed by the culture of where you work. And often that's easy to do because if the processes are, systematically racist, or, if there's still issues that are, this is the way we've always done things, it's really easy just to fall into the habit of blaming it on the culture and rather than trying to drive change of that culture. So I think I completely agree with Tom. Allyship is essential to make change. And I think allies often hold more significant influence than they potentially realize, right? So for me, in particular in the ERG forums, an ERG or a staff association, whatever you might call it in your organization, with no allies, then becomes more of an echo chamber, right? So we're just hearing the same voices talk back to each other. But when you bring in allies who have influence to start to talk about the change that Tom talked about, which is actually, trying to drive at the results that you referred to in the McKinsey survey, that's when we start to see barriers being broken down. And if we look at history and historic moments, those have happened through allies, right? And so I like to pick one because I love Motown and it's the soundtrack to my life, right? And there's no Motown about Berry Gordy, but it took a white person who's a DJ, right, somewhere saying, okay, I'm going to play this black music. That person in that moment was an ally that began a movement, right? And so everyone can do that, right? If you think about those people, it's not one particular person, it's people who are willing to stand against something and make a change.
I love that. I think you both definitely nailed it in terms of the definition, and I like that there were so many different points kind of talked about there when talking about raising awareness. I love the idea of the thought of like ERGs become more of an echo chamber. You see that on a day-to-day basis with the people that you hang out with. You almost get shocked that whatever is going on outside of that, but you definitely need people from the outside to to chime in. But I would ask, based on your experiences with your particular role, so in HR, what are your what advice do you have to ensure that D&I strategies align with HR policies? I guess
Hannah,
start with.
Hannah, do you want to go first?
Yeah.
Okay, sure, yeah. So this is an interesting question, because I haven't divorced the two, right? So for me, they automatically have to go together. So when I think about times where, when I was working on changing, say maternity, it wasn't necessarily the policy, but focusing on an initiative, the outcome was what we were working towards, what we want to do, right? We want to progress female talent. We want to retain female talent. I mean, ultimately, that is part of what you would consider a D&I strategy, right? But the policy itself was the mechanism. So for me, the two go hand in hand. You can't really have a policy that doesn't then align with what the organization is striving to ultimately achieve. So I haven't divorced the two, and I think that's what people should be striving to do from the offset. Where are the areas that we're really going to make impact and drive change, right? So almost start with that diagnostic. And then equally, there's been moments, I was thinking again about this, where some policies or changes have not derived from, even that strategy. Just a moment in time where something has come to my attention, and I felt like me as the HR leader, I can influence them. We once had a talk that someone had arranged in one of our ERGs. I didn't even know what it was going to be about. I turned up, and actually it was someone from one of our sister companies for an organisation I used to work for, who had come to talk about transitioning. And it really struck me, because in her speech, she was basically referring to not feeling included, because she didn't know where to turn to. She didn't know who to speak to. There was no policy that kind of outlined what steps she would have to take or who to go to. When she went to HR weren't educated on the topic. And I was like, actually, that same thing could happen at this organisation, right? Because where is this? What will people do? Someone came up to us and said that. So that sparked my mind to say we need to do something about it. So that wasn't in our D&I strategy at the time, but that was something within my gift to actually be able to go and do. Albeit accepting that I'm not the expert in that space, right? So engaging with Stonewall, engaging with other people who were far more cognizant of how to write a trans policy and how to make sure that the language I was referring to was accurate and so forth. But the whole point for me was, I'm going to make something where everyone could be included, where everyone could feel valued. So and not wait because, oh, well, it's not happening to any of our employees, so why are you doing this now, right? We don't need that in order to start to drive change. So for me, it's that. So it's, yes, aligning with the D&I strategies, recognizing that all policies contribute to your ultimate culture, right? So your grievance policy, your absence policy, an example I gave, in terms of elective surgery and how that's going to discriminate against groups if someone is going through that process. Performance management, that's a huge lever to drive change and progression. So all of it is intrinsic to a D&I strategy for me. But I'll pause there for Tom.
Yeah, and I think I'll piggyback on a point you made, which is, I think, all policy is in my view, it's an enabler or a detractor of culture, right? So I completely agree with that. But it really starts with, I also look at it, to me, D&I is not separate from my HR strategy, right? And when I think about the work I did when I was the HRD for SAP here in the UK, we made significant traction because it was aligned, and it was completely aligned. We looked at our policy structure around that, but I think, the piece is you have to have leaders who are courageous enough to step forward and frankly confront organizations where bias exists. And that's both within your HR leadership as well as within your business leadership. And that is frankly can sometimes be a very lonely place to be, out on the limb by yourself. But I believe fundamentally that part of how you drive change anywhere, whether that's in government, whether that is in the corporate world, et cetera, is through having people who have the courage to do it, right? And no one wants to be told that they are a misogynist or a homophobe or a racist. So how you do this, you do in the right way. You use data, you use information, and you use your life experience, right? And I think that is where, for any of us who have ever felt to be made to feel different, that is a lever that we have that others do not, right? And so I think it's around making sure that you have a very clearly defined strategy where you're measuring outcomes, right? That you are holding people to account, because at the end of the day, all Hannah and I can do is lay out a plan. Fundamentally, others have to execute that plan, and they have to believe in that plan. And if they do not, that is part of the resistance you face. But I think you also have to recognize that you're never going to convert everyone to believe what you believe. And my new thing is, I'm fine with that. Just don't get in my way or anyone else's in terms of what we're trying to drive for change. And if you want to sit there on the sidelines, that's perfectly fine, but just don't detract from what we're trying to do either, right? And I think that's where you have to have the courage to really confront in a constructive way and to call out those things within an organization that you see. And innately, there is danger in doing that to the person doing the calling out. But for me personally, I would not be living my own truth as a leader if I didn't do that. So,
yeah, I mean, something I've definitely seen, and I've seen speaking to a lot of kind of HR and D&I teams specifically, is that some of these D&I initiatives are sometimes seen as an add-on to the HR initiatives. So based on what you all said, like how can you actually ensure this doesn't happen, and that D&I then becomes an integral part of the business?
yeah, I'll take that one first if you're okay with that, Hannah. I think where
sure.
I've seen it work effectively is, and I'll compare sort of two companies I recently worked at who should remain nameless. One where you had a global architecture, right? So you had a very clear global strategy, because we have to also keep in mind, depending on what area you're going after, whether it's race and ethnicity, whether it's orientation, whether it's gender, whether it's disability, whatever the case may be, it will play differently depending upon what geography you are in the world, right? So, but you have to have a global architecture that then, depending on where you are, you can pull down those common things that make sense for your business or for your country or your region or however you're applying that. Where I've seen it not be so successful is where there lacks a common architecture to pull down from, and there is a lack of consistency in what you're trying to drive, and consequently, then you have, 82 D&I programs running around the world that are completely disconnected. So I think that part of it is, again, comparing those two environments. The first one works far more effectively in my view, and I think that's part of where you can see you see the connection between what the business is trying to drive in terms of workforce transformation. I mean, I think every company in the world virtually right now, you talk about transformation, workforce transformation that enables that digital, and what does that mean? It all ties back to culture, and it all ties back to talent. And fundamentally, it's getting people who can think differently, demonstrate learning agility, and who are different coming in. And I think however you define that difference is ultimately up to you. But to me, those are ultimately some of the enablers that prevent it from becoming disconnected. I'm going to stop there and take a sip of my tea.
Hannah, and I'm going to repeat the question. I'm just going to repeat the question just for the sake of the audience. But it could be argued that, as I said, so D&I initiatives can be an add-on to HR initiatives. So the question back to you is, how can you ensure this doesn't happen, and how do you ensure it's an integral part of the business?
Yeah, sure. And I'll actually just build off of what Tom was saying, actually, in terms of not having 82 different D&I strategies running at one time. And I think that's maybe where, this question even comes from, in terms of it feeling like an add-on. And I think that's where everyone just rushes out to do something, to be seen to be doing something. And I think that's, really catastrophic for everybody, because that's not the overall objective. And equally, it's really transparent, right? How bizarre if you can already come and go, ta-da, look at what we've done. That's so unrealistic, and everyone can see through that, how unauthentic and disingenuous it seems. And it shows that there's no care or thought, actually, for the employees and how they're actually feeling, or taking time to understand what the experience is and understand really what the problem is. So completely resonate with the kind of insurgence of rushing out. And if I think about even the number of times I was asked last year to come and to join a panel where everyone was like, oh, quick, we must do a panel. Everyone's doing a panel. So it's all of that kind of panic reaction. And also going back to what Tom said about that accountability piece, I think that's really powerful. And you can tie things to the question. You could tie things to your performance management metrics and how you measure people in terms of how they embed diversity, right? And I know a lot of organizations are doing that by setting objectives. This is something we did at the police years and years and years ago. And that doesn't always work, right? Because it can also still become a box ticking exercise. But there is something about if you're using it as a tool to say, hey, this is what matters, it's at the core of our values, and what have you done as a leader to start to drive some of this change and start to embed it. And then kind of also, again, pick up on Tom's point about there's only so much we can do. And I smile, and again, I've used this before, but I like to refer back to Greg Clark and the FA chairman, and not to shame him, but just to really highlight how much, you You can put all these initiatives together. The FA were doing all of this rollout program. He comes on the television to talk about the great work that the FA was supposed to be doing to combat racism, and instead then highlights his own naivety on the topic, not only of racism, but then makes a homophobic comment and a sexist comment all in like 10 minutes. You know, so, and that really goes to show the HR person probably crumbled in that moment, but all this work has been done. But the leader didn't take time to educate himself, to really believe passionately in what he was actually there to talk about or to do, and just displayed his kind of ignorance. So there's something about people going on that journey, or I like Tom's thought there equally, but if you're not going to be in a journey, step off. And therefore, for stepping off, don't step forward as the spearhead. Don't step forward and represent the organisation when you haven't taken the time to do your homework ultimately. So I think, you know, measuring your progress, challenging yourself and focusing on the areas that are going to drive the biggest impact, which for me are not, you know, the unconscious bias training. It's been shown, right, statistically has the lowest amount of impact, right, but a huge cost base. And again, everyone's like, yeah, we did the unconscious bias training. It was a moment in time. Now what, you know? So I think it's really being mindful of those things.
Amazing.
Oh, go ahead.
No, were you gonna add to a point?
Yeah, I would think just a point I would add on. I think, you know, thinking back in the past year, I think it's also a recognition of how deeply embedded this is in organizations and their behavior and their structures. And, you know, and for me, I think, you know, anyone who is a fellow Gen Xer on the phone, I think we thought by having a diverse life, by having people of various race, creeds, colors, sexual orientations, genders, socioeconomic classes in our lives, that we would somehow magically solve the world's ills. And I think what the events of last year showed me, at least, is how deeply embedded in our power structures, our organizations, and our laws in certain countries, particularly the one that I hail from, and the very foundational elements of the documents that created that country, it is embedded. And so to expect people to come along and tear that all down, I think for me, it then became an instance of, okay, it is now up to me to help tear it down, right? That it's fundamentally is going to have to be people like myself who have had certain privileges who have to decide that, you know, the whole thing has to be blown up, right? In not some anarchist way, but in some sort of controlled method where, you know, we just don't throw everything out. You know, I've seen recent examples of that happen in my own country. But I think hopefully my point's getting across. It's just not, it is so deeply embedded and institutionalized that it is insidious. And I think it, you know, and I think probably most people on this call have felt it at some point. Some minor comment, I love the phrase microaggression, you know, because it's so small. You know, I was called eccentric at my last company. Now, I know I've lived in England long enough to know, you know, what eccentric really means. But when you're someone like myself, where we don't use the word eccentric in America, there is only one way you define that, right? And it's code. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think that that's just one minor example of how it's so ingrained that people don't even realize it. You know what I mean? So I think, you know, that's part of what we have to address through implementing effective talent strategies, through implementing effective HR strategies, that of which D&I is embedded. And to the point that Hannah made, you know, you've got to measure the impact and outcomes. And that's what we want, you know, not just saying we have X% of people in our workforce. Well, great. How many of them are, you know, are they feeling they can bring the full weight of who they are and their humanity to their job and advance within that organization without having to fundamentally change what and who they are?
Honestly, there's so many deep insights with this panel already. I'm trying to write down everything, and gosh, like I'm going to have to rewatch this recording, which this is amazing. I'm going to bring an audience question in. So it's actually a question from Deborah, and I think, Tom, you already touched upon this, but I think it's really important point of conversation where, you know, when you deal with different cultures and markets, how do you ensure that countries where the word allyship is not even translatable rally around the concept? So for example, she mentioned that in France or Belgium, there isn't like a Black History Month. And then there's not that much noise as it would be in the UK or the US or Brazil. How can you make sure employees based in these countries feel as close to the concept of allyship? I love that question. Thank you for asking it. But yeah, I think, Deborah, Hannah, if you want to go ahead and give us your view on that.
Absolutely, it's a great question. It's come up for me again for a long time now, and I think for me. So right now, February is Black History Month in the US. and people are celebrating and sharing their stories. So that's just an opportunity to share a light on a topic, even if it doesn't apply to your geographic location. I'm not in America right now, right? But I can still appreciate listening to and hearing from some of the voices. And actually, I think that's what makes the world great, right? Because actually, if you are somewhere where there isn't, you know, a month for you, a day for you, you can leverage somebody else's and still have the conversation. And I think what's more powerful about that is in taking it into that country and having the conversation. France is an interesting one for me because that often happens in France. It's often, well, we don't have very many Black people here, like in the organisations I've worked for, we don't have very many Black people here, so this isn't our topic. Well, absolutely it is, because you have a community of Black people. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the French Black history. Let's be specific and educate ourselves about what the community that we serve looks like and what what the transitions they've been through have been for them, so that you can better understand. Because once again, inclusion is not about, you know, who the current makeup is, right? It's creating an environment that no matter when someone joins, we're ready. Not like, okay, someone's joined, we should start running around and doing something now. And I think moving forward, it's actually more the countries where the conversation, it moves to, maybe it's more about religion for that particular country, right? Or like if we think about some of the challenges in the Middle East, then it becomes, you know, more on the gender side, and or it could be about LGBTQ, and how do we grapple with that when we're talking about the Middle East, where there's such you know, conflict between different communities. And so for me, it's just having that narrative and having that dialogue and making sure that we don't just wait for the world to tell us what the global day for something is, but actually as an organization, we put it on the table and we start to address it for the people that are our employees. And then what that should do is actually inform local plans, not just the global one. So to Tom's point, we obviously want everything to arc back to a fundamental overriding strategy, but that doesn't mean that locally there can't be nuances, because there need to be in order to be truly representative of, you know, the community.
And I love what you've said, because I'll add on this. To me, this is also highlights the concept of intersectionality, right? So I think if you look at whatever group it is, or however you want to define it, I think that is how I've seen it. You take the idea of inclusion, right? And to Hannah's point that she said so lovely is, you know, apply what makes sense in that country, right? But the whole concept is, it goes back to people who have fundamentally been shut out of a given power structure, who are attempting to gain power to shape what that organization and its people becomes, is sort of the line I continually use. And I think that is where you can, what month it is in the year, whether it's Pride Month, whether it's, you know, it's Black History Month, depending on where it's celebrated, et cetera, you will always find something that drives a difference in the population of that country, right? I think religion is a perfect example. And then, but the concept still applies of people who are different trying to be successful and succeed in a given organization that they are a part of or want to become a part of. So I think, again, that's where, you know, bringing together, depending on where your ENGs are, is always powerful, because there's themes that are woven through all of them. And I think fundamentally the theme is, we want to not just be seen, we want to be in positions that allow us to influence and change, right? And so to me, that's a hugely powerful idea as well.
Amazing, amazing. And obviously this also goes down to the ERGs you have in different regions, countries, and so on. But, you know, now looping that back into a question, another question from the audience. So Jane's asked, you know, what's your advice on how to get HR involved with internal networks? So Jane particularly said that she's just set one up with about 5 colleagues. So is it too early? What's your advice? Yeah, just a quick one. I'd love to hear that from you guys.
Get a new HR leader at your company, Jane, would be my advice. No, I'm kidding. I'm sure they're lovely. Go Hannah there. It was my joke. I'll go after you now.
So I love your energy. No, it's a good question. It's why I actually really wanted to do this particular panel, because I definitely have blurred the lines, right, between my actual day job and my passion for allyship. I don't know where the line is anymore, to be perfectly honest with you. And all the time, whenever with ERGs, I was kind of like, oh, I don't want to be too involved to the point where people felt like, well, you know, you represent, you know, the organization, so I don't want to share my views or hold back. And I didn't want to. Sometimes when you're in those meetings and people are sharing and they're saying, oh, we don't have this, and you're thinking, no, we do. So you don't want to come, you know, kind of going, oh, no, this is what we worked on, and then turn it into your work. you want to allow it to be that space for people to come and be able to share whatever's on their mind or find that sense of community, belonging, exposure, whatever the reason is that they've joined. But equally, if there's nothing, then I think, yeah, go ahead and start something. That's also very much kind of speaks to who I am. And I think how to expand it, that's probably more where my work has been in terms of really trying to promote like what we're doing. And I'm more passionate for ERGs about allyship, because that's where it's crucial. And I worked somewhere where it actually didn't matter which ERG was hosting something. Everyone went to everything. And I just thought this is the most powerful use of an ERG, where you actually walk in and you can't tell which ERG is actually hosting the session, because everyone has turned up to listen, to learn, to grow together. And then, like I said, from that, if I've taken away an objective, or if one of the senior leaders has decided, right, I want to sponsor this and really run away with the event, then that's really about trying to bring about some change. So that's more than where my personal focus is, because I'm still conflicted about how long to stay involved before I kind of dilute too much. And equally, have people tell me that actually we'd like you to come and join now and really drive a particular session. So I think it depends on your organization. I think it depends on the maturity of the ERGs and the size of the employee population, and plus. But kind of linking that to what you talked about with the countries, I don't know if they're related, but countries can group together as well, and still not necessarily lose their voice. If it's like a Benelux thing, then that makes sense, where you can kind of have that discussion. I still think that, for me personally, that would be okay.
And to add on to that, I would say, part of it is around, the ERGs can help inform, right? So it's bringing a point of view around to your HR leader, whoever that is, to say, listen, this is what we see in our organization, right? And it's to help. So I view them as a way to help inform. I think also it is frankly a way to gain funding. I mean, I think back to when in the past few jobs I've had where I've had the ability to control a budget, I absolutely funded all of them. So if someone wanted to start up a new one, I would help provide some structure, I would help provide some funding, I would help provide some guidance. We'd find a senior leader who was actively engaged. And then arguably, in one job I had, I put each of my team, couldn't quite understand why I was assigning them to an ERG. I said, well, if you don't understand that like D&I is now fundamentally part of our talent strategy as a company, as we've talked about, I've clearly missed something. But it was a way to also get them to understand that in order to be, in my view, a HR leader of the future, if you are not driving this, I question if you will be an HR leader of the future, right? And the ability to engage with your business. So I think, again, depending on your size, your scale, and scope, to what Hannah was saying, start with baby steps. The simplest thing is to go have a meeting and say, challenge them. What are we doing around diversity and inclusion in our business? Like, what is our plan? Strategy scares people. What's our plan? Like, what are we doing? And can we provide some insight, perhaps, as whatever the case is, as people of color, as an LGBT person, whatever ENG you're a part of, into that individual? Because I think many people are, this topic, let's be frank, it frightens a lot of people. They don't know how to go about it. And the last organization I was a part of was viewed as being a very polite, nice place to work. Well, if you want to have that inhibits this conversation, because it is not that it's not polite, but it will put people on their back foot, because they will innately, it bubbles forth bias in themselves, right? So I think start with that as a simple step, and then you sort of expand outward from that. Then you start talking about, well, we need sponsorship for this. We need 5,000 for this. We need 10 for this. Here's the return we think we'll get, and our brand. Here's our ability that we think we'll be able to attract segments of talent that we've not been able to, and start to talk. Again, it goes back to what are they in business for? To make fundamentally profit, right? So when you start talking that language and market metrics and things like that, I think it's a huge help.
And just to kind of bounce off that as well, actually, that because of all of that is to give space to this, right? So often when organizations make ERGs the kind of the solution, then it's quite a heavy burden for that individual, right, to take on that work. And then they've got a day job as well, right? And in some places they're remunerated. I've seen it work really well where they can be celebrated, but they can also suffer at the end of the year, where their own day job, right, they haven't ticked all the boxes, or they haven't necessarily performed in the way that they would want to. So definitely, if you're stepping one up now, think about that. Think about how are we going to allow space for these people to do this work for us, because we're going to benefit from that work as well.
Yeah. Co-chairs, have someone doing it on your own is tough. And that was something I actually recommended to all the ones I've worked with is get two people to co-lead it, because to Hannah's point, it can become a full-time job, and it's a lot for one person to take on. So if you have, you can find a partner in crime, so to speak, I highly recommend it.
So funnily, we also run a monthly BAME / Black Network Leaders event, similar to Corporate Allyship. And one of the insights we got from that was one of the top 5 things that comes up regularly with BAME Network Leaders is they want to be incentivized or rewarded for the work that they do, but actually majority have never ever received any kind of reward or recognition, even when it comes to like job performance. So as an HR leader, that's a recommendation I would have, look at rewarding these people. They're integral to your organization.
Yeah.
And they're generally the ones driving inclusion, because they're creating a support network for underrepresented groups within the company. So don't underestimate their value. It's not just a social group, is what I would say. So I guess like you talked a lot about steps when it came to HR, when it came to what to do as a leader on one of these ERGs. But I'm going to turn this around and ask you, like, what are some of the steps HR departments can take to actively act as allies? Given that this is just a job for them at the end of the day. So what should HR departments do step by step?
So I was looking at Lucy's. I was actually looking at Lucy's question, which I would like to address at some point. Sorry, now you go, because now I've lost track of my thought because I was reading her question. Not to put you on the spot.
I'll bring Lucy's question next.
I would say it kind of links to what we've already been talking about, right? So it's like sharing your voice to key topics, engaging everyone in the dialogue, understanding, not being dismissive. I'm actually, there was recently I was on a board meeting, and everyone was kind of celebrating a policy that, we've got a race charter. This isn't where I'm currently working, but something else I'll do. We've got a race charter, and everyone was like clapping, and I was like, so what? Like it was like almost that allyship back in terms of, as a professional, don't be afraid to stand up against documents that don't make sense, right? Like, well, why are we doing a race charter? What does that actually solve for? Who was consulted? How does that link to the overall strategy of what we're trying to do? Rather than this, well, I saw that all these other organizations, they've got a race charter, so now we're going to go and get a race charter. So I think, like I say, in the active voice, use your own expertise to speak up. I coach as well outside of my work, and there are a few people who've shared with me who are HR leaders, and they've tried to go and talk about changing D&I policies from their perspective of either because they're LGBTQ or they're Black, and they've shut down. They're like, oh no, this direction we're going to go. And it's like, but this doesn't represent anybody's voice. Like, this is the white male straight voice, and you haven't galvanized anyone's views. And rather than just walking away from that, sharing your expertise about the data that speaks to, well, hold on a second, this is why I think this will be of real benefit. So I think it's just constantly challenging the organization, as you would do in any other part of your job, right? As a HR professional, that's what we're paid to do. We're not just paid to turn up and be reactive. We're paid for our expertise that we can actually bring. So I would also say, to do that, you have to educate yourself, right? And be clear on what value it is that you're bringing. And I often talk, for me, lots of partnership is what we do at a senior level, right? So there's something about holding up that mirror. So when you get, which is what's happened again the past year, when you get lots of people from different organizations saying, yeah, I'm signed up, I'm passionate about this, and then the first hiring decision comes up and they're like, this is who I'm giving it to. You're like, well, hold on. You just said that we're really passionate about this work and you put all this into strategy, but when it comes to putting it into practice, you're deviating back into your previous ways. And rather than just going with that, holding up the mirror constantly, so leaders can reflect back onto themselves. And the other thing I would say before I start talking is also just sharing, like championing other voices that are doing really great work. So there's a leader I remember who went out and did a lot of work in regards to recruitment. So rather than waiting for the recruitment team to be the ones to come up with the strategy for how to recruit more diverse talent, they tasked their leaders and the leadership team to go away and build a network. They were like, attend these events, make those connections, you find that diverse talent, you approach them, and you get your bench ready. Don't wait for HR to be the solution. So something about, okay, now we've got that great example, let's share that. Let's let that permeate through the entire organization, not just at leadership level, but the entire organization, so everyone can see what allyship looks like.
To add on to some of the points that Hannah's made, I would say back to when I made funding. So again, how are you funding this? It would be one thing that we can do. Again, having sat through, what was it, something like 28 quarterly business reviews. As part of that quarterly business review, we reviewed our sales performance, our customer retention. Part of that topic was a dialogue around how are we attracting, retaining women, people of color, et cetera. So I think weaving it into your general business processes and thinking about it that way is a huge way to show that HR is committed. In addition to that, it is highlighting, again, most organizations conduct some form of talent review, I'll call it, right? And it is highlighting those individuals through that process who are actively engaged in this, who are driving those values within your organization and bringing them forth as examples of people who have had the opportunity to lead what was ultimately a cross-functional team in an ERG, and so who's someone who also is championing the values of your organization. Because I think coming out of COVID-19, we're going to see it is no longer going to just be about technical competence that gets you promoted to the top. If finally, I think we will see after my 25 years of doing this, that how one manages and leads and the concept of emotional intelligence are going to be just as critical going forward. And I think that's what the past year has taught us. And if I can kind of weave in, I think it was the point that Lucy made, if you fear your HR organization, that's a whole, and I'll tell a quick story. One of the first things I did when I arrived in London was it's brought to my attention that someone, an individual, a 15-year veteran of the company I was now a part of, had uttered a racial epitaph behind two men, people of color. I sent one of the people who were off on me. I said, I want you to go. I want you to investigate this, and I want you to come back like a dog with a bone. So I sat with my managing director, who was also new, and on the phone with the senior vice president of marketing, who happened to be based in the UK. And we fired this person who reported up through her. Her response to me was, "Aren't you being too American?" And I said, my response back was, "I'm sorry, I didn't realize that racism was tied to one country. And no, I'm not being too American. I'm espousing the values of our organization, and that person has no place here for them." That is action, and that is simple, that can be taken. So, and again, I know, oddly enough, one of the companies I was interviewing with on top of Apple when I came to Europe was Uber, which of course became a horror story of any type of culture as an HR professional leader you ever want to join, right? So I understand where the fear comes from, but don't let it inhibit you from going forward and finding the right people to help you bring forth things like that. Because unfortunately, I think we also felt we were past a lot of that stuff. And we're not, that happened 6 years ago when I arrived here. And there have been certain other examples of other things that I've had to deal with, or my teams have had to deal with. So, but I did just want to address that question, because I know it's out there, and unfortunately that's where we have a bad rap, and it's unfortunate because we are business leaders first, we're HR professionals second, and we have to balance the need to grow, transform, and perform, and nurture, transform, grow, and drive a nurturing organization. It's a tough sort of triangle to balance, but anyways, I'm going to kind of get off my soapbox, because this is another topic I could talk on for a day or so.
No, I mean, I'm glad you brought that question in. That was going to be the next question. I mean, I'm trying to weave in the questions from the audience, as they seem to go quite hand in hand with everything you guys are saying. So maybe it'd be interesting to get Hannah's take on it. So essentially, Lucy is asked, obviously HR plays an important role in helping individuals address poor behaviors. So there's often a lack of trust between HR leaders and and the general organization and employees. So how do you address that, and how do you address behaviors, particularly like microaggressions, that could be more subtle? So that's just a short way of putting her long question, but Tom answered it fantastically. I'd love to hear your view on it, Hannah, and even like your personal experience.
Yeah, I think Tom really covered every angle there. And I think my personal experience, I've seen it play out in so many different ways, and I think the real power is also for the individuals being comfortable, right, to address it themselves, and not even that point of reporting to HR. Yeah. Like for me, that's always the true test of the culture is, do you need to come to HR because I handled it myself, but maybe come to HR to let us know what happened so that we can make sure that we're aware of what's really taking place. And I remember someone sharing a story with me about a project that they were on, where an Indian man who was sharing the story with me was on a project, and it was him and one other Indian male. And on the project, everyone was going around the room introducing themselves, and he said his name, and then the client, so the client side, said, "Oh, that name's too long. I won't remember your name. So you're going to be Indian 1 and Indian 2." And so there's, all of these people in the room. And in that moment, he felt like, oh my God, this is a client, can I actually say anything? So didn't. And then weeks go by with this Indian 1, Indian 2, right? And if you think about the number of people that were in that room that could have spoken up, to the point of also linking this back to allyship, and him feeling like, actually, I'm really junior. I don't know, whether I would take this to HR, what would happen for the project. Eventually, he builds up the courage to say something to his manager, who obviously isn't on the project with him. And his manager was the one that went back to speak to the client. And actually, even in that conversation, the client was, oh, well, they've not said anything, right? So it's been an X amount of time. So I think everyone's comfortable with it, right? Because of the fact that he hadn't even realized that there's something wrong with his approach. And so then it came to become more of a HR issue, because it was obviously going to affect the project delivery, because obviously we would want to partner with a client who has those sorts of views. And what was really powerful in the end was that individual being able to go back and say, look, this is how that made me feel, right? Like I would never say that to you. Imagine if it was you, and being able to have that conversation with a very senior client. So for me, it starts with something about trying to just giving that one example, and that's quite overt, right? That's not my thing. There was also because it's an example of how no one was an ally in that moment. Nobody in that moment said, we're not going to call them 1 or 2. His name is, and let's pronounce his name and share the name with everybody. No one in that moment checked in with him. No one in that moment went up to the client afterwards. This went on for at least a month. So there's a role that everybody can play, right? And when these things happen, in being able to challenge culture, as well as just HR as well. But I think it's a long-term game, right? In terms of striving towards being in an environment that is inclusive enough for people to be able to share it with anybody. And obviously HR, it would be great to be at the forefront of that. But I think until that point, just being able to share it with anybody is really important.
Yeah, I echo that 100%. I think it's so key that, people feel comfortable in a way that does not, again, no one wants to be called out, right? And I think there's a way to address, I was saying, people can challenge the way I think, but they will never and can never challenge the way I feel, right? And I think it was Maya Angelou who made, I'm paraphrasing her a bit as well, around, people will never forget the way you make them feel, right? So, it's true. Like, how I feel is based upon my experience of my life, right? And what I think is based upon what I've taught and what I've been learned, and my ability to compute that in my head, so to speak. So challenge facts and data all day long, but how I feel and how I am made to feel, more importantly, is something that anyone cannot challenge, right? So I think it's, again, and this is where it becomes an emotive topic, which then I think challenges some people in addressing it, right? But again, I think it goes back to the word that you use, courage. It's feeling that people will never, they probably didn't, and I'm not excusing it, didn't even think anything of it, right? And part of it is they've gotten away with it. It's just how they think. And people sometimes are just, I dare to say it, I'm amazed at the number of people who still lack common sense in this world that I've encountered in my time in it. And, unfortunately, some people are born with it and others seemingly are not. So sometimes you have to gracefully and graciously remind people of certain things in life. So.
Amazing. I mean, you also, Tom, you touched upon leadership and emotional intelligence. You also touched upon, both of you kind of touched upon the idea of, well-being. And there's a question from the audience, actually, from Kate, who talks about a strong well-being strategy. And of course, being a minority in the workplace, having to experience these microaggressions, that could be compromised. So do you guys have examples of times where through HR strategy, like well-being or employee well-being has been prioritized? And how have you kind of gone about doing that?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one first. So back when I was the HRD for the UK, and I think probably part of this was driven by my experience of coming, just having spent 14 years of my life living in California, which certainly in the United States has really been on the forefront of what I would deem well-being, both physically and emotionally and spiritually and financially. So for me, it became very clear that in order to support the transformation of our workforce, we had to have a holistic benefit strategy, which well-being was table stakes, right? So we really did focus on the pillars of, again, financial well-being, physical well-being, and then also mental well-being, which again, when I arrived here 6.5 years ago, I would say, you know, the United Kingdom is maybe not as advanced as it's become in thinking around mental wellness as something to talk about openly, right? And, you know, I'm very much open to share my own story around, you know, part of the reason why I'm on sabbatical right now is I was frankly burned out after, you know, 20 plus years of burning the candle pretty hard at both ends. You know, and that wouldn't be openly talked about when I began my career. Like no one discussed burnout, no one discussed mental wellness. You just, you know, you toughened up and you just charged on. So I think, again, to me, there's absolutely a connection between looking at an individual holistically as a human, right? Which gets to their well-being. And part of that is, of course, looking at who that human being is. So I think, again, that's where, to me, the connection is between well-being and a well-being strategy and driving a strategy of diversity and inclusion and ultimately a cohesive talent strategy. And again, I feel like if organizations aren't embedding this in what they do in terms of the support that they give to people, particularly in the past year. I mean, if you think about the sheer mental stress that we have all been under in terms of just how we've had to all cope individually as people with this, whatever your family situation is, and then your work situation, organizations have probably been caught behind the 8 ball on this. And I don't think really and managers and leaders are not really consistently equipped to deal with this, right? And it really does get to individualization, which then gets to the concept of looking at the individual, which gets to the concept of diversity and inclusion, in my view. So I'm going to kind of leave it there and turn it over to you, Hannah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. So I think most of the examples I can think of, obviously, last year there was a huge surge in terms of people reaching out for assistance following Joyce Flaw's murder, because it was so brutal and because it had, you know, it brought so many things and emotions to light in terms of actually the trauma of reliving an experience and having to talk about it so openly and repeatedly for people. So I think there's obviously those strategies. I think that we were kind of, maybe we were late to them, if I'm honest. So in terms of organizations, you know, really wanting to empower those voices, listen, learn, and understand. I think we did that first and then realized actually this is really traumatic for people. And then we were putting in, you know, those well-being mechanisms to follow. And, you know, there weren't too many things in the beginning. It was more that promoting of an EAP service. And then afterwards realizing that we needed to go deeper for various individuals. And in doing that, it was really about starting with the managers and asking and training the managers for like signs to look out for, whether there were people who weren't necessarily coming and speaking up, and how they could therefore proactively reach out, giving them some tools and resources for how to hold that conversation and keep the space safe before, you know, you even get to the stage of being able to refer someone on if it's more deeper work. So there's obviously that, because that's a particular point in time. But as I think of a more personal experience, I think of someone who wanted to, you know, be an ally, right, and have their voice shared, and stand up as a leader and say, actually, I want to sponsor this. And in doing so, I'm going to have to share something pretty personal about myself. And I think for me, it was about giving that person coaching specifically around, so after this happens, right, and after you shared this, coaching so that they were prepared for with someone external, so that they were prepared for what will follow. Because actually people reach out to you, that there's that own piece of the person feeling like they're being judged, even if they're not, just because now you've exposed something. So I think it does depend on the situation. So we've got one where that affected, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of employees, depending on your organization size, to one that's quite personal. And my thought there is really trying to, in the latter example, we were ahead of it. But even when you're doing, you know, it might be a talk on a topic that you think might not have that much impact, but don't be surprised at how people can walk away deeply impacted by some of these discussions as well. So it's a great question.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you both for sharing like your personal stories there as well. We've got 5 minutes left of this panel, so I'm going to wrap up with one final question. And I'd also like both of you at the end of that to share how people can connect with you or you know, speak to you further if that's something you want. So my question is, what's your advice on how HR leaders, so most people on this panel, can ensure that the company leaders of their organizations are following the guidance on how to be active allies? You can
Tom, are you going to go first? Or?
Yeah, I guess I go back to the word, you have the courage to have the conversation with them first and foremost, demand, frankly. I mean, I think in the, you read, how many times can you read the Financial Times where boards are underrepresented by, name whatever you want to, people of color, women, whatever the case is. You have to, and when I say confront, I don't mean to be combative. I mean to hold, I think Hannah said, hold up the mirror. And begin the dialogue and continually have the dialogue that says, if we're going to survive and thrive in the future, certainly the generation coming into the workforce today expects to work in a world in which they live, right? So to me, it's a non-negotiable for the future sustainability of your organization. But just have the courage to have those conversations with them and continue to have those conversations with them, but come with a plan, right? They're looking to HR to come with a plan around how they get there, but you can't own the plan. I can't own the plan. I have to have others actually own and drive the plan, right? So I think that's the balance you strike, is not wanting to be the one at the end of the year when all of a sudden they're looking at what did we do in terms of our talent strategy, and all of a sudden we've missed our metrics. Well, if you're the one holding the bag, I'm the one holding the bag, and no one else is taking accountability for that. I think that's the key, is to also get the shared accountability around what has to be accomplished and done with senior leaders within your business.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think, I will say, as to Tom's point, try to speak the language of the business, right? So talk about the bottom line and the impact that it's having. So when you're sharing those successes, there was a great one actually that I had of an ERG the other day, and how that ERG, through the power of the discussion and voice, then had an idea, and that idea then got picked up, and then that, translated into some great work being done, which then increased revenue. So also talk about that, right? Talk about the fact that, of going out to tender for bids where organizations won't work with you if you haven't got the basics down. Yeah. So try to speak the language of the business as well to gauge their interest and keep drawing back to their own strategy. So where's the people strategy aligning to the business strategy, which also then includes D&I. So I'd say there's that as well. And I would, again, my same thing about the mirrors, it's about, I'm stealing a Denzel quote there, which is, don't confuse movement with progress. Like he said that the other day, and I thought that's so true, because you can run in place, right? So you're moving, you're running in place, but nothing's happening, right? There's no real change. So it's, really trying to, I heard the other day, like, yeah, we're sorting our agenda. No, we're not. So there's this view that, I've done these things and now we've moved forward, but you can run in place and nothing's actually happening. So let's be clear on what we're actually trying to strive for. So once we actually do start to make change, we can truly measure it and be proud of it. Back to the fact that this is all of our responsibility. We should all care, and so therefore we should all be accountable for it. And I think pushing that accountability one step further would be to that C-suite. If this is something that is not a priority for your leaders, well, how do you feel about that? How bold a stance are you willing to take for leaders who are dormant in this space, and actually really trying to challenge and push past the envelope? So there's organizations like State Street and many others who have moved to chief diversity officers on the C-suite to try to kind of permeate the culture, right? And so that they're partnering with their senior peers and making diversity something that's the top of the agenda, truly, and investing in creating those senior positions and carving out space to truly do this work and have real investment and not just side of desk movement.
Amazing. That was the final question, just 1 minute before close off time. I can say, like, my mind is like, there's just so much information I've written down. This is all recorded. So we're going to send this to you. Please, just have a view over. Like, there's just so many nuggets on this panel. Thank you guys so much, Hannah and Tom. Thank you everyone who's attended. Like, the questions have been popping. There's been so much interaction. Like, it's been a small room, but there's just constantly things happening on the chat. So we're going to send all of you guys a recording right up. And yeah, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you want to hear more about how to work.
Find me on LinkedIn. Yeah.
And Tom, I'm going to try and connect with you, Tom.
Yes, Hannah, I was going to say, yes, we must connect and continue our,
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, and have a lovely rest of the evening, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all very much. Where is that?